It was one of those familiar summer afternoons, where the world felt steeped in the timelessness of nature. Deep inside the heart of a vast, ancient forest, perched on a hill just beyond the bustling Norwegian capital of Oslo, a group of us had made a home. Nestled within the dense embrace of firs and hazelnut trees, we lived in harmony with the land, our small village of tents and makeshift shelters blending into the landscape. Our encampment wasn't much to look at for an outsider, just a cluster of branches and tarpaulin cobbled together for shelter, scattered among the trees. But for us, it was everything. The canopy above filtered sunlight into golden beams, creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. A clearing in the middle of our settlement housed a campfire, surrounded by a circle of logs that had been rolled together to form a communal bench. The fire was always burning, an eternal flame that provided warmth, cooked our food, and served as the heart of our gathering. On that particular afternoon, the campfire crackled quietly, the smoke rising lazily into the air. An old tin teapot, blackened by countless days spent over the flames, sat nestled in the embers, emitting a thin stream of steam. The smoke and steam mingled in the air, swirling together in a slow, graceful dance before disappearing into the shafts of sunlight that filtered through the trees. We sat around the fire in silence, passing a joint between us, as was our custom. The smoke from the fire mixed with the smoke from the joint, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire world had melted into one fluid, peaceful existence. No one spoke. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive. We were witnesses to the beauty of the moment, silently in awe of the world around us. It was just another summer afternoon in our little Norwegian forest, a place that had become more than just a home. It was a refuge, a sanctuary from the noise and chaos of the outside world. But then, the quiet was broken. The sound of dry twigs snapping and leaves crunching underfoot echoed through the still air, signaling the approach of someone new. Our collective gaze shifted toward the hill's edge, where the sound had originated. The forest, usually so calm and undisturbed, was suddenly alive with the anticipation of a visitor. Out of the trees emerged a young man, his appearance immediately striking in the serene surroundings. His curly blonde hair caught the sunlight, framing his face with an almost angelic glow. His light green eyes sparkled with curiosity and excitement, and his boyish features gave him an air of youthful innocence. He was small in stature, with a slender frame that seemed almost too fragile to carry the large instrument slung over his shoulder, a double bass. Of all things, the juxtaposition of his hippie clothes, worn backpack, and the enormous double bass made him seem like a character from some fantastical storybook. It was as though he had wandered off the set of an adventure film and found himself here, in our quiet little world. He smiled broadly when he saw us, a grin full of warmth and relief, as if we were exactly the people he had been searching for. "Hi guys," he called out, his voice breaking the lingering silence. He stopped beside our circle, and after a brief pause, set down his belongings and joined us on the log bench without waiting for an invitation. He seemed to belong here already, his presence fitting seamlessly into the rhythm of our camp, as though we had been expecting him all along. As he caught his breath, the young man introduced himself as Lucas. He was from a small town in Poland, he explained, and had set out on a grand journey across Europe. He was hitchhiking his way through the continent, driven by a thirst for adventure, a desire to explore, and a need to discover deeper meaning in his life. The double bass, as unusual a companion as it was, seemed to define him. He explained that the instrument had been with him since childhood, and even though it made hitchhiking more difficult, he could only catch rides with truckers or drivers who had a roof rack. It was a non-negotiable part of his journey. His eyes sparkled with pride and determination as he told us of his travels, though his tone remained humble and unassuming. Earlier that day, he had been dropped off outside Oslo by a friendly truck driver. He had wandered the streets of the city, looking for a place to set up camp for the night. A kind soul had directed him to our little community in the woods, assuring him that it was the perfect spot for someone like him, a place where travelers and free spirits were always welcome. It had taken him hours to find us, he admitted with a sheepish smile. The forest was vast and our encampment was well hidden, known only to those who had been here before. He had nearly given up, tired from his journey, when he finally stumbled upon our clearing. We welcomed Lucas with open arms, inviting him to set up his tent wherever he pleased. It was an unspoken rule of our camp that anyone who found their way here was welcome to stay for as long as they needed. We lived by the laws of nature and kindness, offering each other shelter and companionship without question or expectation. Lucas spent the rest of the day settling in, finding a spot among the trees to pitch his small tent. That night, as we gathered around the fire once again, he played a few soft notes on his double bass, the deep, resonant sound blending with the crackling of the flames and the whispers of the wind in the trees. Lucas stayed with us for a time that felt both fleeting and infinite, the days blending together in the way that only happens when you live close to nature. Time lost its meaning in the woods. There were no clocks to tell us when to wake or sleep, no schedules to keep. We lived by the sun and the seasons, letting the rhythm of the earth guide our days. Each morning, Lucas would wake early, his tent barely visible among the trees. He would spend an hour or two sitting by the fire, sipping tea from the old tin teapot, his eyes distant as though lost in thought. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful, measured. He seemed to be in the midst of a deep personal journey, one that went beyond the physical act of hitchhiking across Europe. After breakfast, Lucas would take his double bass and head into the city. We didn't ask him where he went or what he did, it wasn't our way to pry. But over time, I began to piece together bits of his life outside the forest. Occasionally, I would see him in Oslo, busking on Karl Johan's Street, his double bass standing tall beside him as he played for passers-by. His music was soft and soulful, a reflection of the quiet intensity that seemed to define him. When he wasn't playing, he roamed the city, always on the move, always searching. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of him, slipping into one of the city's food charity centers, or rifling through a dumpster behind a restaurant. He never asked for handouts, but he had a resourcefulness about him, an ability to find what he needed without asking for more than he deserved. Back at camp, during those quiet mornings before he set off for the city, Lucas would sometimes share the thoughts that had been swirling in his mind. He spoke of philosophy, of life's meaning, and of the search for something greater. He wasn't preachy or overbearing, his musings were more like puzzle pieces he was trying to fit together, fragments of a larger truth he had yet to fully grasp. One morning, as we sat by the fire, he told me about his latest plan. He was planning to travel to northern Norway, to a small, remote village where he would volunteer on a clay building project. It was a community effort to construct homes using natural materials, and Lucas hoped to learn the skills necessary to one day build his own clay house back in Poland. The idea of creating something tangible, something that would stand the test of time, seemed to excite him in a way that little else did. And then, one morning, Lucas was gone. His tent, which had stood quietly among the trees for weeks, had vanished. There was no note, no goodbye. It was as though he had simply melted back into the forest, leaving no trace behind. At first, I thought he might have gone into the city as usual, but when he didn't return by nightfall, I knew he had moved on. I pictured him standing by the side of a highway, his thumb extended and his double bass resting on the ground beside him, waiting for the next trucker to offer him a ride to some new destination. He had come into our lives like a whisper, and he had left just as quietly. But in the time he had spent with us, Lucas had left a mark, a small, indelible imprint on our little community in the forest. We sat around the fire that night, as we always did, passing the joint in silence. The smoke rose into the air, mingling with the memory of Lucas, who had come and gone like a dream. Lucas's departure lingered in the air for days, like the faint echo of his double bass resonating through the forest. We spoke little of him, but his presence was still felt in the quiet moments around the fire, in the spaces between our conversations. Life in the forest carried on. New travelers came and went, the cycle of our transient existence continuing as it always did. Yet something had shifted. His quiet wisdom had left a subtle mark on us all. Even those of us who rarely spoke found ourselves reflecting on the fleeting nature of time and the paths we all walked. The forest seemed a little different too, as if it had absorbed the energy Lucas had carried with him. I often imagined him somewhere far to the north, his hands covered in clay, shaping his future one brick at a time, as he had shaped his journey. The forest, now quieter without him, continued to whisper its secrets, and we, who remained, listened closely, waiting for the next traveler to join our circle. In the weeks that followed, the forest seemed to breathe a little differently. Lucas's absence was a reminder of the impermanence of our existence there, a place where people came and went like the seasons. Each new face brought with them stories and experiences that became part of the ever-shifting mosaic of our little community. We weren't bound by time, yet we all knew that nothing lasted forever in the woods. Sometimes, as I sat by the fire late into the night, I found myself imagining where Lucas might be now. Was he up north, his fingers raw from working with clay, learning the ancient craft of building with the earth itself? Or had he moved on again, hitchhiking along lonely highways, the double bass still by his side like an old, faithful companion? It was hard to say. But in the silence of those nights, something Lucas had said stayed with me, the idea that we are all searching for something, even if we don't quite know what it is. Some were looking for freedom, others for meaning, and some, like Lucas, sought to create something lasting in a world that constantly changes. His journey reminded me that even in our quiet, hidden world, the search never really ends. Life in the forest continued its steady rhythm, days filled with the rustle of leaves, the crackle of the fire, and the distant calls of birds. New travelers arrived, blending into our circle like Lucas had, bringing with them new stories, new dreams. And as we welcomed them, I realized that we were all, in some way, part of the same journey, travelers moving through time and space, leaving traces of ourselves in the places we passed through. And so, we carried on, waiting for the next chapter to unfold, as the forest whispered its endless secrets around us. As the summer deepened, the forest became more alive with its own rhythms. Lush, green foliage thickened, and the air smelled sweet with pine and earth. The campfire remained our constant companion, flickering like the beating heart of our little community. In the evenings we would gather around it, sharing quiet moments, but there was always an unspoken gap where Lucas used to sit. His silence, once so familiar, was now replaced by a sense of absence. Yet, in a strange way, Lucas's departure had stirred something in all of us. Some of the others, who had long been content in the forest's embrace, started speaking about their own dreams and plans. Marta, a gentle woman from Romania, talked of returning to her homeland to cultivate a small herbal farm. Eric, a carpenter from Sweden, began sketching designs for treehouses, inspired by the simplicity of our forest homes, but with visions of something more permanent, more deliberate. I found myself thinking about my own journey. What was I doing here? Had I come to the forest to escape or to find something that had always eluded me? Lucas's words echoed in my mind, his quiet determination, his belief in building something lasting. Perhaps I, too, was searching for a way to leave a mark, something tangible in a world that often felt fleeting. And as the days wore on, a restlessness spread through the camp. It was subtle at first, but noticeable nonetheless, a shift in the air. Conversations around the fire became more thoughtful, more introspective. The forest, with its deep silence and endless time, had a way of forcing you to confront yourself. It was a place to hide, yes, but also a place where truths, once hidden, could rise to the surface. One morning, after a particularly long night of reflection, I realized I could no longer stay. The forest, once a refuge, had become a mirror, showing me that I, too, needed to move on. Like Lucas, I had been searching for something. Now it was time to find out what that was. The decision to leave came quietly, like a soft breeze rustling through the trees. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, but rather a growing understanding that the forest had given me all it could. The peace, the stillness, had been a gift, but now I felt the pull of the unknown, of the world beyond the trees. As I packed my few belongings, I looked around at the camp one last time. The others were still there, immersed in their own thoughts, their own journeys. We had shared a chapter, a brief moment in time, but now it was time for me to step forward, into whatever awaited me next. With one last glance at the ever-burning fire, I turned and began my own journey down the hill, the path ahead both uncertain and full of promise. Like Lucas before me, I ventured out with no clear destination, just a quiet hope that, somewhere along the way, I'd find what I was searching for.